Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm always nervous that we're not going to have people coming, so thanks. I'll tell you how we got Brian here. It's the first time he's hearing the story too. So, last fall we had a Jewish literature book discussion series, and so Brian was one of the participants, and he was one of the youngest. Actually, he probably was the youngest. for our library, he knows he was the youngest person there. So anyway, in the course of this, he was making all these great comments and insights and asking questions and talking away. It was great, and I'm always on the lookout for people to do book reviews, so I'm like, I got to get this guy here to come and talk about a book. So, but I didn't know he was a teacher. But when it turns out I found out he was a teacher, I wanted to do this book anyway. So I didn't know any young teachers. I know a lot of teachers, but they're all my age. So they've been teaching for 20, 30 years. So anyway, Brian's only been teaching 6 years, so he still is a young teacher. The book is called Letters to a Young Teacher by Jonathan Kozol, and as I wrote on here, I don't know if Brian saw our newsletter, Jonathan Kozol's been writing books about education since before Brian was born, so I'm really happy he wanted to do it too. So he's going to tell us about the book, and Letters to a Young Teacher by Jonathan Kozol. So here's Brian Rhode. He teaches first grade out in Poston Kill.
Thank you so much. I want to say thanks to Joe and to the library for affording me this opportunity. Yes, I teach first grade, but I'm happy to have the opportunity to come over and speak with a more mature audience. Part of it is selfish because I want to make sure that, I've watched sometimes career teachers, especially career primary teachers, they eventually talk to everyone like they're 6 and 7 years old, and I really fear that. So if I do ask any of you to please raise your hand to give me a question, I apologize in advance. But I didn't give Joe my script changes, but I've been involved in education for 22 years, and now some of you are saying, he must have been slipped decaf this morning, or who does his Botox? I got to talk to that person. But I kind of did a little play on it. I went to school, and so I was involved in 22 years of education, the 6 that I've taught, as well as there's some overlap there, but as well as the other years that I spent in school, as well as, look at this, see, I can't even do the math up here. This is first grade. This is beyond first grade math. Look at me. Oh, no. No, but the other years that I spent not only in elementary school, high school, but eventually doing my bachelor's degree as well as my postgraduate work. I have a master's degree in elementary education that I received from Westchester University in Pennsylvania, and then ended up migrating north with my wife. This is her home territory. So we came home again, and I'm very happy that I currently hold a permanent teaching certification in New York State, as does my wife. So we're very happy about that. We really feel like we've arrived in terms of the education world. So that's a little bit about myself, and I suppose I do teach first grade, and I never thought I would end up in first grade. I actually, if you would have asked me in college if I would have ended up as a teacher, I would have said no. My dad's a teacher. I wasn't going down the same road. But not only did I end up in teaching, but I ended up in primary. My experience has all been kindergarten through 2nd grade. And I would have said no, maybe upper elementary, perhaps middle school, maybe even college or high school at some point. But 6 and 7-year-olds, I don't know. And that's where I've been, and I really enjoy it. And part of the challenge I find is to prove to those that the professionalism required in the teaching arena is required in those early years just as much. It's not all wiping noses and tying shoes. I have my share of that, but it takes a thoughtful and dedicated person as soon as the kids walk in the door. And that's one of the things that has attracted me to Jonathan Kozol, because while his actual teaching experience was rather brief compared to this much more lasting occupation he's taken on of being an education critic and a supporter of moving education forward, he just has some wonderful insights about what it takes, I think, to be a truly effective educator. And before I go any further, I want to get a feel for the audience here. Like, how many educators or retired educators do we have? All right. Great. And how many of you are familiar with Jonathan Kozol prior to this? Good. I love that the same hands went up. Joe said, are you familiar with Jonathan Kozol? I said any teacher worth their chalk dust knows who Jonathan Kozol is. I was first exposed to him in my college work with Savage Inequalities, which is just a very impassioned and powerful book, and one that you leave saying, I can't believe these are scenes from America. This doesn't seem right. And most recently I read his last book, The Shame of the Nation, which again talks about where we're headed in this country and some of the missteps that we've made, and how he's trying to call us out saying, we have some more work to do. And so I very much respect his voice in education as one that is unflinching, one that is honest, and one that is a voice for those who don't have a voice themselves, mainly the poor urban communities in this country. And so I was very much intrigued to hear about a book that he was writing to mentor a teacher. Oh, this is wonderful. And then when I found out it's a first grade teacher, I thought, oh my goodness, this is fantastic. So I was very much intrigued by that. And then when I picked up the book, I was even more intrigued to read the title, Letters to a Young Teacher. I thought, this is wonderful. I think Jonathan Kozol is someone who not a lot of people need to read. But a man who's written books, I've written down some of his titles, who's written other books like Savage Inequalities or The Shame of the Nation or even Illiterate America, might be a bit unapproachable to some people who kind of read that and say, that sounds provocative, but I don't know if I really feel like feeling mad about reading this book or getting upset or some combination of both. So I thought this was a bit of a more approachable title for him. And then I read the subtitle, and it's the National Book Award winning author and educator gently guides a first-year teacher into the joys and challenges and passionate rewards of a beautiful profession. I said, gently guides. I'm like, the man who wrote Death at an Early Age is going to gently guide. I'm like, I have to read this book and find out what kind of advice he would give to someone who's green in the profession. And so I was really happy to have the opportunity to go through this. And just to give you a bit of context about Jonathan Kozol, most of you who are familiar with him probably know his work better than I do. But from the text that I've read, as I said before, he was not trained as a teacher formally. He went to Harvard University, studied literature. He was also a Rhodes Scholar, and he went to Paris for a couple of years to study writing. And then at one point, he decided he wanted to come back to America and teach. And so he came back to the Boston City Schools, and at the time, they were happy to have anybody who was interested in becoming a teacher. So they took him in, and he was put in the Roxbury section of the inner city. And his first class of students, now I meant to say that his first group of students were in 4th grade. I wanted to avoid class or classroom because I didn't want to lead you to a wrong assumption about the first environment that he taught in. He didn't have his own classroom. He taught in an auditorium with another group of 4th grade students, a choral group, a sewing class, and then also a group of students and teachers who were rehearsing a Christmas pageant all through that entire fall. So now already as a teacher, I read that and I say, how do you educate these children in an environment like that? Well, later that year, he was transferred to another 4th grade class. This time he had his own classroom. However, he was the 13th of 12, he was the 13th teacher that year. These kids had 12 teachers that year. At one point, 7 came and went in as little as 10 days. So again, not only do you need that environmental stability, but what about the teacher stability? So he knows what it was like to get down and dirty and really get in rough with some of the toughest circumstances. And then, later that year, he kind of thought, these kids aren't responding to me as much as I'd like, and that's understandable. And so he thought, maybe I can change. He's like, I'm tired of some of these prescribed curriculums. Let's see what else we can get these kids interested in. And along the way, he interested them, as a literature major, he has a very much love for poetry. He had introduced them to Robert Frost, of which his administrator said, that's wonderful. These kids will really benefit from hearing about Robert Frost and being opened up to that kind of culture. And so then later that year, he bought a book of Langston Hughes' poems, an African-American poet and writer. And he brought those in, and he read some of those to the kids, and he highlights this in the book. One of the hardest students in his class opened up for the first time and came to him and said, can I borrow that book, please? And she took that book, and she memorized the poem that he had read that day. And she came back, she was excited. Well, a week later, Jonathan Kozol was fired from that position, and his crime was curriculum deviation. Langston Hughes was not in the curriculum, and he shouldn't have read it. And this happened from the same administrator who had praised him for reading Robert Frost, which wasn't part of the curriculum. But he read Langston Hughes, and he got fired for that. So he's also aware of the prevalent injustice that still occurs in the school systems. And he highlights towards the end of the book, I'm jumping ahead, but just to give you more of a sense of him, he talks about kind of like the grassroots effort and the fire that ignited around him in the community of parents who are outraged finally having a teacher that stayed and genuinely cared about their children, and then to have him dismissed for something like this, for reading the African-American children a poet who's African-American. And so there really was an uprising that happened in that community, and he highlights that as well. And it's important to know that because through this book, it's really kind of different from things he's written in the past. And some of the things are exactly the same. Some of the themes that I saw in this text were his themes of sincerity. You can't fool children. They'll know if you don't care about them. They'll know if you aren't interested in their rights and seeing right done to them. And you can't fake it. So you have to be sincere. And that comes across in the way he mentors this young teacher. Also, justice. Justice is lacking in many parts of this world, or in many parts of this country specifically. He writes about in many of his books. And he takes the opportunity through this text as well to highlight situations, not only for this young teacher, but to kind of round out some of the arguments he makes and the advice he gives to her, but I suspect for the larger audience that will hopefully read this book. And another one I've seen is love. The genuine love that he has for children, the genuine love for justice, and the genuine love for people. And there are appearances of some wonderful characters in this book to highlight that. So what he does is he's invited into the classroom of a brand new teacher in, I believe she's in the Boston City Schools as well, named Francesca. And he accepts her invitation. And upon seeing her, he really is taken with her, likes her teaching style. I think he sees a lot of himself in Francesca. And so then strikes up this correspondence, which is later turned into this book. And as I read it, I was really interested in what would this man say to a young teacher, especially a first grade teacher. I certainly went into this with selfish motives. What would he say to me? I'm in my 6th year, and there's a little line of wisdom that says you start teaching after your 5th year. So I'm happy that this is my 1st year of teaching, and just not a year of keeping my head above water and avoiding panic attacks and wondering if I'm doing more damage to these students than actually helping them. So I would still welcome to any kind of advice that can be thrown my way, and especially from an author like this. So I was happy to read it. And now as I read it, I kind of saw 3 parts emerge from this, and I kind of labeled them, and I'll kind of say them at the front and then tell you more about where I saw them develop. The first part, it's the lengthier part of the book. The first 9 chapters I've come to refer to as practical teaching advice as only Jonathan Kozol can give it. And then towards the middle, I think it's unavoidable for him, I call the middle part of the book Jonathan Kozol's sounding board, where he kind of starts to come into that fire that he's so known for. And then finally at the end, I really appreciated the end of this, which I'll hope to highlight throughout this talk. And I've called it Mentoring a Teacher to be Bigger Than the Job. And so let me start at the beginning. The first couple of chapters, they're kind of unassuming enough. He talks about very basic things, which are very helpful to a teacher. You're walking into an environment that is very unpredictable, very spontaneous. And you can spend those times creating your plans and your boundaries. However, you have to be aware that things are going to change in a moment's notice. But the Kozol way is to say, embrace that. Don't change these children. Embrace the spontaneity that they bring to life and see what you can work with them. As he goes on, he says other things, like you really need to create chemistry with your kids. It's important. If your kids don't know you, don't like you, don't trust you, how do you expect to educate these children? But in his own Kozol way, he takes it further and says, Jessica or Francesca, I understand that your administrators are going to be looking at you, and they have curriculums that they need you to follow, and they have tests that they need your kids to pass, and they have things that are very important to them. So, basically, find the hoops you need to jump through them well, close your door, and get to the business of teaching. So it kind of has that more of that broad mentoring aspect. Any teacher can benefit from knowing that you have to create a good culture in your room. But then you have, coming from Jonathan Kozol, who says, I know how rough it can get, and I know how stifling it can get. So trust yourself. Put on a little bit of a show. Tell your kids there's a certain amount of a show that they need to put on. And then get to the business of teaching. Very interesting twist, I thought. And then as he moves on, he talks about more things. There are going to be kids, Francesca, who just aren't going to like you. It's going to happen. But then in his Kozol way, he says, and why shouldn't they be angry? Perhaps they're drawing from, quote, their energy, they draw their energy out of a deep-seated fury of the marginality to which they'd been consigned. So he's saying they're not mad at you. At this point, they are aware of injustice, and I think they're kind of mad at everybody, and especially those who are kind to them, because they don't know what's going to happen, or they don't know what you've got up your sleeves. So again, for her, she's talking about, you're going to have troubled students. But one of those themes of sincerity and love is letting them know that you're here on their side and you care about them and you're here to do the best for them. Reach them, and then you can teach them. So a lot of things that are applicable to people across the education field. And he talks more about, embrace the things that they bring to you. Don't always make things pre-prescribed for them. Don't always think you have to listen to others who say that they know what a first grader is supposed to say in November. Listen to yourself. Trust your own authenticity. Trust your own sincerity. And trust your own freshness, which is neat. He really builds her up in this as a young teacher and a professional. And one of the great themes of Kozol as well through this book is he, from the get-go, he says, you have entered a profession, you are a professional, and trust yourself and what you can bring to this. But at the same time, a piece of advice that I really appreciated from someone who I think is very wise is that he said, another thing, Francesca, is learn from the veteran teachers. They aren't obsolete. They aren't in your way. Not all of them have tendencies that we might say are them being sticks in the mud. They have practices that work. They've been here and done this longer than you have. Learn from them. And that will really round out your teaching as well. something that he touches on in those first 9 chapters. So as I look back on this, I thought, this really reminds me almost of an image of like a mentoring walk. They're walking together. And almost like Jonathan Kozol's the mentor. He's saying, Francesca, these are some things that you need to know as a teacher. These are some things that I've learned. And these are some things that will benefit you. But way off in the distance, they start to approach a large soapbox. And darn it if Jonathan Kozol just can't jump on that soapbox whenever he starts writing a book. And it's kind of unavoidable in this one as well. And that kind of brings it closer to the second part, which I called Kozol's sounding board. And as they approach it, the flavor of the book changes a little bit. These first are really like directly linked to the teacher's experience. He draws from things he's seen in her classroom, specifically good practices that she's done, and ways to really encourage her to continue in that path. And then we start to get to a chapter that he calls, there's one where he jumps on an experience where she shares that she was in Vermont at a conference, and she gave a talk about diversity and something that she calls the ugly little secret in this country. The ugly little secret is that most schools that use a diversity curriculum or a plan for teaching aren't diverse at all. And that's really kind of true, especially when you read more of Kozol. He has the statistics and the anecdotes to lend his weight behind this. And he does in this. He says, you're right, because, quote, the percentage of black children who now go to integrated public schools has fallen to its lowest level since the death of Dr. King in 1968. So he kind of takes her experience and he says, good for you. You're seeing something that's wrong. Pursue that. But for the reader, he also says, this is true. I know. I've done the work. I've been around schools for a long enough time. But again, it's, the flavor kind of changes. The next one, he takes the opportunity to kind of amp up Francesca. She's mad because she was at a teacher day, and they had a workshop woman who she calls the Meta Lady, M-E-T-A, Meta. And she said the problem she had with this woman is that she had all of these wonderfully large words, all of these prefixes and suffixes that she liked to add to her language, but really had nothing to say. And Kozol again is like, bravo, Francesca. You've cut through all of the red tape and you've seen this is a problem in education. And you're going to confront this. There's going to be a lot of heavily worded statements and documents that come from top down to tell you how to be a teacher. Beware of those. In fact, the name of the title is Beware the Jargon Factory. There are people around who are going to tell you how to teach, and they're going to use very sophisticated language, but they're not going to say anything at all. So again, I loved this because of the Kozol-esque fashion of mentoring, saying, stand on your own, trust yourself, be sincere, because a lot of people are going to be insincere, and it's going to come in a heavily worded package to try and fool you. So now we're approaching the soapbox. We're just about there, and Jonathan Kozol has positioned himself comfortably on top of it. And it seems like the next few chapters, Francesca's kind of left there on the side, watching her mentor steamroll all of the issues that he feels are the most divisive and the most destructive in education right now. And at times, the field seems to be very loosely connected to Francesca's experience. He talks about the constrictive nature of high-stakes testing and the way they've turned a lot of education experiences, especially in urban communities, into pre-subscribed, boot camp type lesson environments, where we have all of these things you need to learn. And where do we get all of these things from? Well, these are what you're going to need to pass the test. Kozol really comes out hot on that issue in his, and he also, and then he comes, and if you think a guy can't burn brighter, the next chapter, which is titled The Single Worst, Most Dangerous Idea, which is the voucher system, and the privatizing of public education. And he, once again, in that chapter, he has a lot of wonderful things to say, things that make sense, things that are never two-dimensional. Because he researches them, he has anecdotes to talk about children who experience this environment, and also children who don't. Children who have more freedom, teachers who have more freedom, which tend to be in more affluent areas. So again, you believe the author. But I find myself kind of going, this is gentle guidance? I feel really bad for Francesca. The poor girl says, Jonathan Kozol, teach me. And now, when I was in my first year, there were times that my worst worry of the day was, can I take attendance, get a semi-accurate lunch count, and not have chaos break loose in my room? And now Jonathan's asking Francesca to consider, is she assimilating into a system that is going to constrict and destroy these children? And I think, oh my goodness, if something's going to keep you up at night, Francesca, it's certainly not going to be, did you forget to prepare them for their spelling test on Friday? And that continues. And I think the climax of this sounding off portion of the book, called It Is Evil to Lie to Children. And you think, boy, what did Francesca do? But really, again, his theme in the Kozol fashion is larger than this person. And he's saying, the lies that we tell these kids is that anyone who says democracy is finished and democracy is just is lying. And don't put up with that with your kids. So it does go back to that theme. He's trying to mentor a teacher who is going to see through all of those things and see the important issues that are at stake, even for kids who are 6 and 7 or younger. So then we move into the final portion, and this I call mentoring a teacher to be bigger than the job. Oh, but prior to that, let me step back just a second. If it doesn't get even more removed from Francesca, the final chapter, 13, of what I coined that sounding off portion, he talks about how middle schools aren't working and why they should be gotten rid of altogether. And I thought, boy, Francesca, aren't you glad you invited him into your room? I'm like, middle schools? This says, what does this have to do with you? But he does connect it to her experience. His point in the chapter is saying, you create a very nurturing environment for your kids. Unfortunately, they won't have that all the time. And one of those places where he sees it crashing the most is, in his opinion, in the middle school area. You might say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, John. But it's a view to give consideration and say, what can we do? How can we change? And I think this is part of what he's saying to Francesca. Be aware of this and understand that this is where your kids are going, and what can you do to help? But then I'm like, Francesca, boy, I'm sorry. But you had a book written for you, I think. I'm not sure after I got to this point, but it does seem to connect to your experience a little bit. And then it's the last part that he really does bring it back. He has 2 more remaining chapters called Teachers as Witnesses and the final Seeds of Hope, Sources of Resilience. Where in 14 he talks very much about the experience that I mentioned at the beginning when he shared the Langston Hughes poems and he was fired for that. And then the following reaction that came from the community. And what he's saying to her is, when you get involved in this and you get involved in this profession and you're a person who's sincere and you're a person who loves and you're a person who seeks justice, there's going to be a line that you come to, or you're going to draw it in the sand. And you're going to say, this is where I stand for these children, and I'm willing to fight for them. And Kozol sees that experience as him doing that and putting even his occupation on the line for doing what he thought was right. He said, I'm happy to say, Francesca, that most people I know who are good teachers and who are in these positions who've gotten fired like this, they'll find another job. Not everyone, though. So he's kind of, again, this is the type of mentoring that you don't always hear. You might have to take a stand on something, Francesca, and it might cost you everything. Are you willing to do that? because that's what you need to do for these children. And in chapter 15, he kind of tries to say, I've made my business to fight for justice in this country. And I want to tell you it's worthwhile. And I want to tell you about who makes it worthwhile. And a lot of chapter 15 involves anecdotes about not only children that he met in Francesca's room, but also a wonderful little girl named Pineapple, who comes up in many of his texts. And just a spitfire of a little girl who he has known for many years and goes to school in the Bronx. I'm not exactly sure where in the Bronx, but although at this point she's a young woman. But anyway, he goes back to her story and saying it's times with her and times with her family and times with the people who rallied to me that make this all worthwhile and make this a profession that's worth going into. And then almost as adding a final lens in his epilogue, he tells a wonderful story about his 10-year relationship with Fred Rogers. And that's the last time I'll refer to him as Fred Rogers, because to me he's Mr. Rogers. And he got to know Mr. Rogers after Mr. Rogers read his book, Savage Inequality, and they ended up meeting and having a relationship that lasted for about a decade before Mr. Rogers passed away. And I think he adds that character at the end as a wonderful lens to go back through the entire text and to say, from the start to the finish, this truly is a mentoring text. Even in his middle portions, when he starts to burn hot and become fiery and sound off about issues that seem to relate more so to his work, you see that it does affect Francesca because she's gotten involved with this group of children and these people, and it affects them. And one of the wonderful things about Mr. Rogers is that he always taught that you need to let kids be kids, because there's nothing wrong with that. And they're wonderful, and they're brilliant, and they're creative, just like they are. So listen to them on their level and work with them. And I think it's a great thing that he brought up as well at the start and throughout all of this, is to understand how genuine you need to be. And so almost his soapbox lecture kind of takes on more of the feel of an impassioned sermon. And at the end of his epilogue, he has some words to say to Francesca, which I think are a very appropriate benediction for what he says to her. And then I have a final thought on the text. He says, "To you, Francesca, and to all the other energized and hopeful younger teachers who will follow after you during the years to come, I'd like to end by saying that I pray you'll never lose the sense of joy and tenderness that brings good people to the task of teaching in the first place. And when it is needed, I also wish you rightful anger, vigorous denunciation, and the saving grace of sly irreverence from the soul-destroying practices and terminologies of experts who are positive they know what works, but who seem to know too little of the hearts of children. Resist the deadwood of predictability. Embrace the unexpected. Revel in the run-on sentences. Celebrate silliness. Dig deep into the world of whim. Sprinkle your children's lives, no matter how difficult many of those lives may be, with hundreds of brightly colored seeds of jubilation. Enjoy the wild flowers." And so I was left saying to myself, Francesca could handle this, the advice that was given to her and the way it was. Because I think what Jonathan Kozol saw in her is the kind of teacher he wanted to tutor with this text. And if you love them, he's saying, the children, you will fight for them. You will not accept the injustices that are thrust upon them. You will not accept the lies that say, this is as good as it gets, kid. And you'll make sure that you do the best by them. And I think in a career like Jonathan Kozol's, seeing all that he's seen and being involved with people whose lives have been so hard, This is as gentle a voice as he can muster. And so at certain points you think, I'm not sure how gentle this is. It seems more like you're getting hit with the book, not reading the book. But as I said before, I think this is the sincerity and the gentleness that he can bring to issues like these. And when talking to an educator, if it is a genuine, sincere, loving educator who's interested in justice, no matter how young they teach, 5, 6, 7, younger, on through, they're going to be interested in these global issues. And Francesca is really that teacher. And this one is worth reading and keeping, I think. And I believe that it's a must-read for all of those. I wrote that myself, and it's set on the jackets as well. Those involved in education, those getting into education, should definitely pick up this book. Those of you unfamiliar with Kozol, this is a good one to start with, I think. And then to see if it's something you would like to read more about. Because education affects us all. The children that I'm teaching are hopefully the children that are going to be taking care of me when I'm in a more mature position in life. And so I am very much so invested in that. And so I definitely think that those who are interested in all that the teaching profession involves, and they don't just want a job, this is a book to listen to. And this is a book to treasure. Thank you very much.
If anyone has questions.
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say that the children that you deal with are very, very lucky.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
How many other young men do you know who are teaching first grade?
You know, ma'am, I'm the only one in my district.
Well, more power to you.
Thank you very much.
And you're great.
There are some other men who have other elementary school professions, but you're right. You're right. Thank you very much. I'd be happy, though, to... Any questions? Yes, sir.
How long did it take him to get a job after he got fired for teaching that poetry? I mean, I just, in the practicalities of the
Right.
world today,
Right.
does he hide that in his resume in the next job? I mean, it's
You're
nice
right.
to be great, but you got bills to pay.
Yeah, you're right. And I think he mentioned it, I think, in this text, but in others, he did get a job, I think, soon after. And it was teaching in a more affluent district as well. So it was nice. He got to see both sides of the coin, so to speak, when it came to the education experiences. But you're right, and that's why almost that advice that he gives is so difficult, especially in certain areas you go to. New York is a very competitive area for education, and so much of it, getting jobs at this stage, seems to be who you know. And if you burn a bridge like that, it's a hard pill to swallow. So
He didn't have any problem getting another job.
he didn't have any problems getting another job. He didn't. Now, you're right. He could. And he kind of talks to her in the text like saying, I understand that this is difficult, and I'm not telling you to do something that's going to get you fired. He's like, but I just feel pity for those people who have swallowed their beliefs for so many years and kind of fallen into line to not stir the water.
I can add my experience to this gentleman's question. I was fired for standing up for teachers' rights. And the Commissioner of Education made a ruling which set the standards to improve conditions for all teachers in New York State. And I was hired by another educational institution immediately.
So there you go. He was sharing how he was fired for standing up for teachers' rights, but was hired by another institution immediately after that. You do have to rely on your character sometimes, and while it gets so difficult, we have some friends who currently, a friend of ours who lost his job very unexpectedly, and you don't want to be trite and say, oh, you'll land on your feet, because you know how hard it is. But I know that I really try to subscribe to that because he does have a good character, and he has other people expressed interest in him for employment. And it is, and I think Kozol is just saying, at what point will you draw that line? And are you comfortable with recognizing yourself after so many compromises? He's saying you're young, you're fresh, you're full of fire, Francesca. And I'm saying don't ever lose that. I think is really significant advice. Yes?
I have a two-part question.
Sure.
First, did Kozol realize that he was jeopardizing his job by bringing in the poetry by Langston Hughes? And second, when he was fired, did he question the administrator as to why he could bring in the poetry of Robert Frost, which was also not, and yet he couldn't bring in poetry by Langston Hughes?
Now, for the first part, no, he didn't know that was going to be a controversial text that was going to get him fired. Because like you had said, he brought in Robert Frost. I think W.B. Yeats was another poet he brought in to introduce to the kids.
But did he get permission from the administrator before he did that?
The first time, the administrator, the way he relates the anecdote, said, "Thank you for bringing in Robert Frost. I know it's not part of the curriculum, but these kids need to be exposed to that kind of literature." And so I think, in fact, he was encouraged by the reaction of the administrator, only to then bring in Langston Hughes poetry and was subsequently fired after that. And in the book, I think he did go to the administrator and say why. And of course, then the powers that be become very tight-lipped, and they say, well, it's curriculum deviation, Mr. Kozol, and that's enough. And so then that's when the community around him ignited and said, this is absolutely ridiculous, and enough is enough.
Yeah. Was the administrator black or white? I mean, that would be a real issue.
He doesn't go into that. He doesn't go into that, but you're right. The text he wrote before this, The Shame of the Nation, he talks a lot about the direction that education seems to be heading. And the subtitle is called The Rise of Apartheid Education in America. And really the whole book he talks a lot about in that one chapter when he says schools are becoming very segregated again. A lot of schools now, a lot of the work that was done prior to Brown versus the Board of Education is being reversed. Because the federal government is, in my, certainly not, this is my impression, my view. They hand it over to states and municipalities, and they start to say, look, we've done the work and we think it's working. I think it's time. And a lot of courts are reversing forced integration, and they're saying they've started to see the benefits of all of that work and struggle that was done through the 60s and 70s. And they're saying, that's enough. And they're reversing it, and what they're finding is it's falling back to the way it was. He's saying it's starting to approach the same levels that it did prior to Brown versus the Board of Education. This is starting to look like a society, in his opinion, more after Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal is okay. However, his work unearths that it might be separate, but it's not equal either. And where I came from your question is black-white, both these administrators get into districts that are very challenging and are stuck with so much red tape because of failed testing and the way the No Child Left Behind laws work currently. They're all based on these test scores. And if you fail too much, too often, you are actually then penalized financially. And they have to show these scores raise. And so it becomes an environment of just very much a stifled environment, the way Kozol talks about it. Just drill and practice, posters, walls, just wallpapered with all the standards that need to be met, all of the rubrics that need to be met. Rubrics are kind of like the outlines, the checkoff that you have to get in order to be proficient in a skill. And black, white, Latino, Asian, he's finding that people are going in with good intentions and getting caught up in bureaucracy. He doesn't mention in this instance. I suppose after reading some of him and this was certainly my own view seeping into it. I would hazard that the administrator was white. But he doesn't say specifically. It's just, you kind of get that feel from it. Yes, ma'am?
And does the charter school reflect this breaking down of, and I think they're more or less going along with it because they feel
Right.
they really can't fight it?
Right. Charter schools are an interesting movement. My first 3 years were in a charter school. I began as an instructional assistant for kindergarten, and then it was first grade, then kindergarten, and then I taught my own second grade classroom, all of which in a charter school in Pennsylvania. Excuse me. And I think from what I've read about Kozol, and to kind of add mine, if he ever sees this, he can disagree with me, but to kind of say what I think he thinks is that the issue with charter schools is he would rather, and I would rather, see an investment in the public school system. Strengthen it. I began my candidacy for the President of the United States right here and right now. Thank you. Although I have a couple years before I qualify. No, but one of the issues I saw with charter schools, they kind of become a public-private hybrid. They're publicly funded, and they're within a school district. However, they set their own curriculums, and they're supposed to create a curriculum that is unique and not being done in the school district around them. However, after working there, one of the big struggles for charter schools is they end up often becoming independent entities. Sometimes by choice, often because of money. They're draining money from the public district, and a lot of times people are already squabbling and struggling for that money, so they don't take a positive attitude towards these charter schools. And what we saw in my situation is that we didn't have access to the kind of systems and leadership that a district can offer. So for me, I would rather see a strong district, because you need people who are trained as special ed leadership, people who have curriculum development skills, team leaders, getting together across a district, having a larger pool of professionals to bounce ideas off of each other. So I definitely see the charter school is a movement that's saying the system's broken, we need to try to do something. And that one is one aspect of it. But I suppose my own personal view would be to not throw the baby out with the public district bathwater and get rid of it completely. Yes?
How qualified are their teachers? Don't they have to meet the same state requirements that all teachers have to meet?
Now, with our charter school, there is charter school law. I'm not sure if it's federal or state, but in Pennsylvania, at the school we were at, you could have a certain percentage of teachers who didn't have to be certified. Very small, like less than 5%, I believe. And in fact, I benefited from that because they took me on before I was certified and allowed me to teach, and it almost killed me. There's a reason why you get into a mentoring relationship as a student teacher, because it can be the end of you to take on all the responsibilities of a classroom. Here in New York, I'm not sure. But I think what's also unfortunate in our country is states don't even have the same standards for teaching. And that affects the opinion of the professionalism. In New York, in Pennsylvania, you have to have a master's degree after so many years, and in order to get your permanent certification. And new certifications now are bringing tags that say not only do you need your master's degree, you need so many credits or hours of continuing professional development as you continue to practice. But my principal was just had to leave us for a couple of days out of this cold, hard New York winter to go to a conference in Hawaii. I know it's a sacrifice on his part. But one of the things he said when he came back is even in Hawaii, the teachers don't have the same certification standards. You even have a lot of people who aren't certified. Right. And you need people who are highly trained to be teachers. And even with this character, Francesca, she's got the fire. And you can have the fire, but you also need the guidance. You need the guidance too, I think. And I've benefited very much from sharing ideas professionally. And it's a very underestimated profession, I think, sometimes, with the difficulty of it. And I like to make the analogy for my parents. I say, consider this. Consider you're a manager. And now the population of employees you have don't want to be there. And they make it clear. And you're supposed to make them productive. But they also make it clear that they don't really care what you're producing. And they might be productive. Or they just might make your life hell if you try to make them productive. And see how long you stay in business. And some years, that's what I do. So I've become a master of motivation. And, I think people who work with people can also learn from Jonathan Kozol and the power of genuine sincerity and compassion and love, how far it gets you in this. Any other questions? Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.